Welcome back and welcome to this perspective. In this video, or in these next few videos, I want to give you a more systemic picture of IFS that really gives you an understanding of how the inner system can look, and it's a beautiful metaphor you can use to understand why parts are active, how they are active, what happens if multiple parts are active. And in the later videos about therapy, I will use this model to really explain what happens in IFS therapy and what also happens in the places where I think we can go beyond therapy with IFS. But more on that later. This model I have developed using the Tom Holmes model he uses in his book and integrating a few things I've read in Jay Early's book, so it's kind of a mishmash of different perspectives on IFS. And the very basic first distinction, and this goes back to Tom Holmes, is that we can look at our inner world, at our inner landscape, as being comprised of two layers. Now, this would be the layer of the parts that are active in us, the parts that are currently active, we are aware of them, and they influence our current behavior, perception, all of that, all the different points we made in the videos before that happen when a part is active. So this is the active part. I won't write it down. And this is what he calls the storage of parts. So all the different parts we have are in storage, and they can become activated at various points in time and then come into the active part and influence our experience. But as long as they're in the storage, they are not currently influencing us, influencing our experience, influencing our actions. So basic distinction, those two layers of parts. And to just make it practical, a part that is here, not influencing us, can become active, influence us, can go back down again, not influencing us. So we can have all sorts of different parts in the storage, and only those that are currently active influence us. That's the basic model. As you can see, I named them. The basic metaphor Tom Holmes uses for this, and I think this goes back to a Thich Nhat Hanh, a model, so Buddhistic psychology, is that this is our living room. This is the living room of our consciousness, and that whatever is here is present in our living room. This metaphor will expand a little further in a moment. And this is again the storage. Now, there is one more point, and that's that we are not just made up of parts that are active or not, but that there is also the self. So that the self is actually beyond just active or in the storage. The self is the consciousness itself, so that it encompasses both of them. And the basic idea, as Tom Holmes has it, is once there is a part active, the self is not present purely anymore, and usually the part will have taken over. We have the protectors, and it's mostly the protectors that are here in storage, but we also have other parts. We have the exiles, the parts in us that are hurt, and they are called exiles because they are exiled from the living room. So we have a lot of activity to make sure they don't get into the living room, but in a way they're actually exiled from the storage. Because anything that's in the storage, any part that's here, can just become active. And the exiles are not even in storage. So they're kind of outside of this. You can imagine that as maybe in the dungeons, buried somewhere, whatever fits for you as a metaphor. But what I think is really good to imagine and to have as a visual representation is that, as we talked about, the protectors work really hard so that these parts, number one, don't get hurt, but number two, they don't just suddenly activate and flood the living room, flood our active system, so that we experience that hurt, we experience that pain, we experience all of that again. So in a way, you can imagine that the protectors are actually organized just around the exiles. So if we imagine we have multiple exiles here, and we might have some exiles that are protected by multiple parts, but we have others that are protected by one part. Let's just make the image more complete. So these parts are there to protect these exiles, but also keep them out of consciousness. Now, what does that mean? That means that if we come into a situation where any of these protectors fear that that the exile could be hurt or could be triggered, they will become active and start influencing us. They will start influencing the way we perceive the world, maybe looking for safety. They will influence what we do, what we think, how we feel. And if it so happens that we are in a situation where this exile wants to come up, this protector will do everything to push it down and probably become even more active. Little side note, this is a distinction where we can distinguish between managers and firefighters. I try to keep it as simple as possible. That's a future video distinguishing the managers and firefighters. So with this, you kind of have a visual representation of how the inner system looks. That in the storage you have the protectors that build around the exiles to protect them, but also to keep them out of consciousness. And there will probably be multiple parts active quite regularly. Now, some of the parts, and this is represented with this wonderful lion, will be active and they are just healthy. They go down into the storage, they're actually not connected to an exile, they're just there as a healthy part. They come active. Maybe this lion is therefore is a part in me that very much enjoys and goes into competitive sports, but does so in a healthy way, in a way that actually brings me joy and aliveness. And this part can become active, become inactive again, go back to storage, but it's not connected to one of these exiles. That's the basic idea of protectors, healthy parts, exiles, and how the whole structure is built. And I think just this image as a map, as a representation, is very powerful. At the same time, I think there are certain aspects that it doesn't map as well. And I think this is where we can expand on this map with a very simple concept that comes from Jay Early, as far as I know. And that's the concept he introduces of the seat of consciousness. Why do we need this seat of consciousness? Let me go one step back. One problem I have with this model is we might have one part active, this part influences how we behave, what we do, all of that. That's this part. But if we have two parts active and both of them want different things, this one wants to work really hard, this one just wants to enjoy life so that I don't feel down, which part wins in the end? Is it which part is bigger? Is it which part is more persuasive? Which part decides how we behave in the end? And this is where the seat of consciousness as a metaphor or as a concept comes in. So the seat of consciousness represents the place in us that determines our identity in the moment. So whichever part is in the seat of consciousness determines who we perceive ourselves to be in that moment. So depending on which part is here, we will have different perceptions, different feelings, all of that. Other parts that are active will also influence us. So I might be in this, I just want to enjoy my life. I'm at a party, somebody asks me for a drink and I'm just like, what the hell, of course, I'm gonna have another drink. And even though there's this part that I know you're not gonna be able to work well tomorrow, this part can still decide. This part has the last say in how to be, how to feel. This part is in charge because it's in the seat of consciousness. So that's the basic concept of the seat of consciousness. And if that comes into this model, it explains very well that sometimes we might have multiple parts active in us, but none of them in charge. Sometimes we might have different parts that are in the seat of consciousness, and then it's usually very confusing. But often we will have one part that's in the seat of consciousness, and for instance, that part will then decide how we feel towards other parts. So in this situation, we would think that part is a downer, and I don't like that part of me. Whereas in this situation, it would maybe feel more like, oh God, these impulses, always wanting to have fun, it really brings me away from being my best at work. So, because this is what determines who we feel, or what we feel as I. When we say I in the moment, it's whatever or whoever is in the seat of consciousness. As you may have noticed, I put the seat of consciousness into the self, or at least partially into the self. Half of it is in the self, half of it is not in the self. And that has a reason. And that reason is that the self is actually the natural inhabitant of our seat of consciousness. This goes back to what we talked about in the video about the self, that Richard Schwartz experienced it as he asked parts to step aside. So a client in therapy comes, and in the beginning they are blended with this part. This part has taken over. So they think, feel like that they're angry at themselves, they think they need to work more, etc., etc. And then he asked the part to step aside. And if the part actually steps aside, it either goes into the living room or even into storage. It can be that a part is like, okay, I'll step aside and I'll really give you space. I'm still there, but I'm not on the seat of consciousness anymore. But more often they step aside into the living room. Now, it might be that then there is another part. Again, we can play the whole game, ask it to step aside. But what happens is, when all of the parts have stepped aside, the natural inhabitant of the seat of consciousness is the self. So when the seat is empty, you could even say the seat is the self. Meaning that we don't then have to do anything to try to fill this with qualities that are good for us. We don't have to work hard to then make the self filled with compassion or something like that, but that's what's naturally in the seat of consciousness when all of the parts have stepped aside. This is what in therapy often happens, that we try to work with that with that part. It's there, but we don't like it. What do you feel towards that part? I really don't like that part. It's always having me work so hard, it's annoying. And then when we ask this part to step aside, and the self is the natural inhabitant of the seat of consciousness, we automatically, naturally feel positively towards that part. We feel compassion, courage. We feel calm towards it. We're not scared of it anymore. We're not angry at it, because we are self. We are in self automatically as soon as the other parts have stepped away from the seat of consciousness. So this assortment with the self as the natural inhabitant of the seat of consciousness would actually be the healthy way our psyche looks. Parts are still active. Parts will be active till the end of our life. But the self is present and the parts have not taken over. So even if there is something in us, a part in us that gets super scared or that has this impulse of, I really need to work as hard as I can, the self is still there to hold that, to be with that. That's what clients, that's what people experience as the part is still there, but they feel spacious towards it. They can welcome it. It's okay that that part is there. And this, as the normal as the healthy, maybe the natural assortment, is unfortunately not normal. What is much more normal is that people have parts occupying the seat of consciousness almost constantly. So it might be this part now, then that part, then it's even an exile taking over for a moment, which then makes other parts come active incredibly quickly. We are so used to parts in the seat of our consciousness that often for people the first time this experience of, whether that is in IFS therapy, whether that is through meditation, whether that is through yoga, that experience of spaciousness, calm, courage that just feels natural, that feels like this is me, is so incredibly powerful, because in a way this is you. This is who we truly are. This is our true nature, self. And at the same time, all of these parts are also us. They are our parts. So this model of having the seat of consciousness, who is in the seat of consciousness, what in the previous video was shown with the part being right in front of the camera, who is there, makes such a big difference. And this model, I find, depicts that very well, which is why in the next videos I will be using this to explain how does IFS therapy work and what are the kind of steps IFS therapy takes to then work with this system and help both the parts to relax, to heal, but also the self to actually be in leadership in the system as it naturally should be. So that's what we're going to look at in the next video series.
You never know what's around the next corner.